Good morning, class. This is session 11, and it is on the Kings. First of all, I'd like you to turn to page 30 and following, and you will find the Bible history timeline. And this section right here, under about 1000 BCE and United Kingdom, says Saul, first king of Israel, and David takes Jerusalem as capital. So that's the time period that we're working in. When we left off last week, the Israelites had taken possession of the Promised Land, also known as Canaan, the land west of the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. When they went into the land, Joshua divided the land into 12 parcels and gave each tribe of Israel a portion based on the size of their tribe. You may recall that the Lord told the Israelites to take possession of the land. The Lord himself would go before them in battle to guarantee their victory, but the Israelites didn't trust the Lord and made treaties and allowed the Canaanites to live among them, which led to intermarrying and tolerating and adopting their pagan customs and idol worship, and that was the reason the Lord told them to take possession of the land. This apostasy, which as I taught you last week is a fancy word for sin, led to punishment from God. Under the weight of their punishment, the people would cry out, God would hear them and send them a judge, a leader of God's own choosing, to lead the people back to faithfulness. The judges are what we had in last week's class. However, not all the judges turned out to be good judges. Isn't that just like people? However, this pattern of apostasy, punishment, cry out to God, God hears them and sends them a judge, happened over and over again. In fact, the Bible tells the story of 12 judges before God decided a new game plan was necessary. So this is what you need to know. The period of the judges had a few brief periods, relatively speaking, when the Israelites thrived. But as was their pattern, that period always collapsed and ended up with the Israelites being ruled by some other kingdom. So, sick of being ruled by kings of other ruling nations, the Israelites asked God to give them a human king too. That was, they believed, the key to their success as a nation. In the midst of their suffering, they forgot that they had God on their side and no human king could compare. God said no, gave them the judges. But the Israelites blamed them for their plight and persisted in demanding a human king like all the other nations had. One that they could actually see and listen to as he took command of their armies. So today's session is about the kings of Israel, whom God allowed Israel to have. Now, about the Lutheran Study Bible, the story of the kings is spread out throughout several books of the Bible. Today we're going to be in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. The introduction to each book are as follows. 1 Samuel can be found on page 449. 2 Samuel can be found beginning on page 499. 1 Kings on page 543. And 2 Kings on page 592. At the beginning of each of those chapters, you will find the articles entitled Background File, What's in the Story, and What's the Message. These articles can be found at the beginning of each book of the Bible and are filled with helpful material that will help you understand the content of each book. Now, into the story. I would really love it if you read 1 Samuel 8, 1-22. That's the story of Israel demanding a king. In 1 Samuel chapter 9, verses 1-27, Saul is chosen to be Israel's first king. In 1 Samuel 10, 1-8, Samuel, the prophet Samuel, anoints Saul as king. In 1 Samuel 10, 17-24, Saul is proclaimed to be the king. In 1 Samuel 13, 8-13, Saul's made an unlawful sacrifice. You'll want to read about what he did. in 1 Samuel 13, verses 13 and 14, God talks to Samuel about finding a man after God's own heart. That's an important expression. And in 1 Samuel 15, verses 10 to 34, God rejects Saul as the king of Israel. And then in 1 Samuel 16, 1 to 13, David is anointed as king. In 2 Samuel now, we're in 2 Samuel now, chapter 5, verses 1 to 6, David is anointed as king of all Israel. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 6 to 12, David makes Jerusalem the capital of Israel. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 1 to 17, God's makes a covenant with David. That's a very important covenant that comes into play here during the season of Christmas. And in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through chapter 12, verse 23, is the story of David and Bathsheba. If you want some sultry and scandalous stories about David lusting after another man's wife, you'll want to read the story of David and Bathsheba. In 1 Kings chapter 1 to 27, there is a struggle for the succession to the throne after David gets old. But in 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 28 to 40, we find that David's son Solomon rises to the level of king of Israel. But then in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 to 41, there are a bunch of stories about all the things that Solomon screwed up. That section's called Solomon's Errors. Solomon is often looked to as a bright, brilliant guy, but he also made some major problems for himself. And then in 1 Kings chapter 12, you're going to hear about the northern tribe seceding from the southern tribes. So that's important for next week. After the death of Solomon, in about 931 BCE, most of the Israelite tribes, the 10 northern tribes of Reuben, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Ephraim, and Manasseh, except for Judah and Benjamin, refused to accept Rehoboam, the son and successor of Solomon, as their king. The rebellion against Rehoboam arose after he refused to lighten the burden of taxation and services that his father had imposed on his subjects. One of the many mistakes that Solomon made that the other kings of the various tribes of Israel refused to forgive him for. Another leader by the name of Jeroboam, so we have Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Jeroboam, who was not of the Davidic line, an ancestor of David, was raised up by the rebellious northern tribes and was proclaimed king over all Israel at Shechem. The northern kingdom continued to be called the kingdom of Israel, or just short as Israel, and sometimes called the kingdom of Samaria, while the southern kingdom was called the kingdom of Judah. So now the whole Israelite nation, the 12 tribes of Israel, have splintered into two groups, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. Remembering that David named Jerusalem the capital city of Israel, the whole nation, and Solomon built a temple to the God of their ancestors there, this caused a problem for the northern kingdom of Israel, because you see, Jerusalem was in the southern kingdom of Judah. They did not want their citizens making pilgrimage to the temple at Jerusalem to make the required sacrifices and to give offerings. So they created their own capital of Shechem and their own site of worship at Mount Gerizim. This is all going to be very important as we continue our study of the Bible. These and other issues caused a civil war between the two nations that lasted for years, and because they spent too much time fighting each other nations attacked them as well. Although there were times when the two nations got closer together, the nations were never again united. History is recorded by the victors, and next week we will briefly hear how this division disappointed God and how God punished all of Israel. Much later in biblical history, the future remnants of the northern kingdom of Israel, also known as the kingdom of Samaria, will become known as the Samaritans and will be looked down upon as unclean by the first century Judaism, which is made up of the descendants of the southern kingdom of Judah. Well, back to Kings, referring to the illustration on page 545 of your Lutheran Study Bible, we see the complete list of the kings of the United Kingdom at the top and then the divided kingdom shortly thereafter. A timeline that I will bring to class will better illustrate the tumultuous times that Israel experienced during the period of the kings. So, having done a quick tour of the books of Samuel and Kings, we have the briefest review of how the Israelites went from being led by the judges to having human kings. The important learning here is that the real problem with the Israelites is faithlessness in the God of their ancestors and a lack of obedience to God and God's laws, commandments, and rules given to them as a gift so that they had clear boundaries of what it meant to live as God's chosen people. As we have learned so far, they were not godly people under Moses, nor under Joshua, nor under the judges, and today, nor under the kings. As a result, the Israelites continued in the pattern of apostasy, punishment, cry out to God. God responds by sending them a Savior in those various forms over and over again. Aren't they just like people? The story of Israel's kings is not so much about a nation's history as it is about a people's relationship with God. Trying to make sense of a senseless situation, the people of Israel reviewed their story and their beliefs. What they and we find in this reflection is that our views of God as all-controlling and all-powerful aren't as comforting in times of suffering and hardship as knowing that our God's heart breaks when we turn away. God is always in a relationship with us, calling us closer without coercion, choosing love over control. Now, here are the essay questions. I would like you to answer any 4 of the following 7 essay questions, answering each one in 150 of your own words. So, question 1. Referring to Bible passage 1 and 2 above, so you'll have to look in the lecture to see what Bible passages those were, how would you describe how human beings select leaders? Has it changed today? We just went through a presidential election, so you have some good fodder for discussion. Question number 2. Referring to Bible passage 5 above in those Bible passages I enumerated, what was the real cause of Saul losing favor with the Lord? Not the actual act that he did, but the spirit of his actions. What was it? Question number 3, referring to passage 6 from the Bible above, what did David do that pleased the Lord? Number 4, referring to Bible passage number 11 above, what was the covenant that God made with David? And why is it important to us today? Referring to, this is number 5, referring to Bible passage 12 above, what sin did David commit and what was his real sin? So David was a sinner to be sure, but there is a sin listed in there in the Bible passage number 12 above. But I want to know, it's not the sin that he did that was his real sin. You'll figure this out. Number 6, referring to question 5 above, in your own experience with sin and forgiveness, what is the real issue in Bible passage number 5? And referring to Bible passage 15 above, what was Solomon's error? Again, there are the actual things Solomon did, and then there is really the sin that God is really concerned about. Well, email me back your answers at the website, at the email address, pastor@zionohio.org, by next Sunday, November the 29th. See you in class.